In the previous video, we set up a vSphere HA cluster, and we're just now completing the process of getting the agent up and running on the hosts. Now, you might have seen some details there referring to an election process. Basically, what we want is to have one of the nodes within the cluster handle the correct startup from the other nodes. So one of them will determine that it's in a good health state, and then other machines will have to communicate with it in order to join up and form the cluster. Now, in this case, all went well, and I didn't get into any errors from the HA process. If I had, what I'd probably see is a warning indicator up here that there was some kind of a problem. So right-click on that host, and you'll see there's an option, Reconfigure for vSphere HA. And we'll see the task will say something like, it failed, it wasn't able to do it, couldn't complete for whatever reason. Or if you see that for whatever reason it's not telling you that, but you're having problems with HA, we could go in and try and just reconfigure for vSphere HA. And we'll see that it turns HA off temporarily and then goes back and reconfigures the HA agent. Now, in addition to that, you may find that you even need to take a host all the way out of the cluster and then bring it back into the cluster in order to make the HA agent get completely reinstalled. I've had to do that several times on earlier versions of VMware. I haven't had to do it yet on vSphere 5.1. Now, we can see that we are getting a warning saying that in this case, the vSphere HA agent couldn't reach the isolation address, which is the default gateway by default. So if we go into the advanced properties of the HA cluster, we could specify other isolation addresses, and it might be a good idea for me to do that, but I'll take a look at that separately. Now you'll also notice that it's giving us a warning saying that the number of heartbeat data stores is actually less than what's specified that it's supposed to have. But for the most part, that should be okay. The other option that we have is to temporarily turn off HA in the cluster. So if HA, again, for whatever reason, really continues to not function the way you expect it to, then it may be useful to turn off HA temporarily for the cluster and then re-enable it globally. But if we take a look in the summary page, we see we have a vSphere HA section now. I don't have admission control turned on, so whatever virtual machines I try to start up, it will start up. And we can see that I can currently tolerate the failure of one host, about what we would expect in a 2-node cluster, and I don't have any designated failover hosts. I am using host monitoring, I am using VM monitoring, but I'm not using application monitoring. If we click into this advanced runtime info, you'll see that we have some interesting information here actually. Something referred to as slot size, and then you'll see we have total slots in the cluster, the number of used, available, and failover slots. So if you are using resource reservations for your virtual machines, and you also are using admission control in your HA cluster, then admission control is certainly not going to be able to, microscopically inspect the current state of the VMs or the hosts every time we try to start up a virtual machine. So what it does, it divides the resources in the cluster into this series of slots based on capacity. And that depends, we could end up with larger slots and so on, depending on how performant our system is, how much resource utilization our VMs do. But in this case, HA has determined that, a unit of CPU capacity is going to be 32 megahertz of one CPU and 27 megs of RAM. So it says I've got 88 slots in the cluster, I've got 7 currently used, I've got lots available, and I can accommodate a total of 44 slots in use based on my configured failover capacity of one host. So you can see effectively we're leaving aside half of the resources within our cluster in order to ensure the same level of performance after a failover event. And we can see how many are powered on and so on, and how many hosts are currently good and how many hosts in the cluster in general. If we click over to cluster status, we can also see, who the current master is that's handling the elections and the brokerage process of joining the cluster. We can see the number of hosts connected to it, not counting itself. And then we can see the virtual machines that are protected or not protected. Might not be protected because of a lack of VMware tools, for example, or that they're not on the right data stores to be able to be restarted on another host. And we can also see the heartbeat data stores that we're using here. You can't configure anything, but it allows us to see what's currently used for the data stores. And if it's detected the wrong ones or decided to use the wrong ones, then we might want to go in and intervene and configure that manually. So if we take a look at my cluster and I go over to virtual machines, we can see that we have a fair number of virtual machines on host 151 and also on 152. I think in the interest of not causing massive performance problems, I'm going to take down 152. I'm going to jump out of this window for a second, and then when we come back, we should see the catastrophic effect or the recovery of this catastrophic effect of losing half the nodes in our cluster. So I jumped out for a second, went to VMware Workstation, and did a hard power off of node 152. So we can see that we are now showing an alarm, and you may want to take a look at the alarms video for more details. But if I click on that host and go to alarms, I can still communicate with vCenter. So my interface continues to work here, but as we can see, we may be having a little bit of difficulty getting any details from the host through vCenter. If I take a look at the cluster or some other area, we may get a better idea of what's going on. So we can see here the 1082.1152 of vSphere HA host status. And again, we don't really get a huge amount of detail here from these messages in the alerts, but it tells us that definitely something has gone bad with that host. We can see that after a bit of monitoring time, that the virtual machines and the host itself are now showing as disconnected, and HA should take over to restart those virtual machines. This doesn't prevent downtime. It's not a perfect solution for preventing downtime, but it's going to allow us to minimize downtime and ensure that the system can respond automatically. And we can see that we now have an alarm saying that vSphere HA failover is in progress. We're regaining control of those virtual machines, and then they're going to go ahead and get powered up. What we may want to do is look at a feature called fault tolerance. With fault tolerance, rather than running one virtual machine on one host and then simply bringing it back up on another host when the time comes, we can actually run the same virtual machine on two hosts simultaneously. Now, not in a way that they're going to interfere with each other, but literally the same virtual machine, the same execution of the virtual machine on two hosts simultaneously in lockstep mode effectively. So we can see that our virtual machines have gone ahead and been started up. The system is back up and running in a probably very unbalanced state. I don't think DRS is going to be very happy with what's happening now, but of course it doesn't have very many options for how to deal with it. And we can see that we have some things going on in the summary tab. We can see that a failover did occur. We can also see that it's not able to find a master HA agent. Well, there's only the one node anyway. So that gives a bit of detail as to how HA works. Reasonably simple. However, it's very important that you consider what it really means to be healthy in your environment. And looking at the advanced settings of HA and providing different isolation addresses, for example, my hosts are isolated. They couldn't talk to their domain controller. They're not necessarily going to make the right decisions on network visibility or on data store visibility if we don't go in and set data store preferences and so on. But HA in and of itself is fairly straightforward. But definitely take a look at the VMware HA configuration guide, because VMware does provide excellent documentation. And of course, take a look at the other videos.